Hello, and thank you for watching Atheists Talk. My name is James Zimmerman, and today I'd like to welcome you as we discuss the results of the 2012 election. Now that we're in 2013 and that's all behind us, what do the results of that election mean to us? What does it mean to secularists at large, especially atheists, of course, since this is Atheists Talk? To help us define that and to talk about some of the goods and some of the bads from the election, we have David Pacheco. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
David is a board member of the Minnesota chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, which was just organized about a year ago at the beginning of 2012.
Yes.
So maybe you can start by just telling us a little bit about what that organization does and what it stands for.
Sure, absolutely. Actually, Americans United for Separation of Church and State was started back in 1947.
Oh, okay. I think, was I talking about the Minnesota chapter?
The Minnesota chapter,
okay,
right.
Go ahead.
So the Minnesota chapter, we had a relatively informal meeting a couple of years ago in November and December, and we decided to form a chapter here.
Okay.
We felt that there was enough going on within the state of Minnesota that it would be a good idea to have a local chapter, and there's a lot of support for it in this state as well. And we also, at the time, felt that there was a very significant issue coming up in the legislature, or coming up before the electorate at that time, around the marriage amendment, which we felt was a very significant separation issue. And so we started up the chapter. We officially started in January of 2012, and we spent a lot of time last year putting our support behind the coalition that was formed to defeat the marriage amendment. So Minnesotans United for All Families, along with Outfront and the Human Rights Campaign and Project 515. So a lot of different organizations were under that umbrella, that coalition umbrella, and the Minnesota chapter of Americans United was one of those. And Americans United in general, the group that was formed back in 1947, formed by a quite broad coalition of religious and non-religious organizations at the time. It's an organization that's dedicated to preserving the separation of church and state, the constitutional principle of separation of church and state. And we believe that's a very important principle because we believe it's the best way to ensure religious freedom for all. So it's, while we have a large number of atheistic or agnostic members, we have religious members as well within Americans United, simply because, again, I think they agree with us that maintaining that separation is really the best way for everybody to express themselves and their own religious beliefs in the way they want to. And so the freedom of conscience and religious liberty really depend on the right to believe or not believe in the way that you see fit about your particular religion, and also to be able to share those beliefs with others, which has to do not only with freedom of religion, but freedom of speech, obviously, and the right to contribute money, the money that you earn, only to the religious organizations that you want to, and not have that money be taken out via taxation, for example, and given to religious organizations that you may not particularly feel like supporting. But also the right to teach your children the way you want them to be taught. So quite a few basic principles that have to do with keeping the government out of mandating conscience. There is a secular set of laws, there may be religious laws. The two should not mix, really. If all laws should be, at the end of the day, if they come from the government, since the government is secular in nature, should have a secular reason to exist, and that's what we strive to promote.
Yeah, that makes sense. So would you say the majority of members are of a religious bend?
It's a good question. I think it varies state by state. So the different states will have different chapters, and depending on who organizes them and who sets them up, you might have different ratios. Definitely, we have a lot of religious members across the country of Americans United, and they feel in a very similar way that their religious freedom is best preserved. Yeah,
I definitely understand where they're coming from. I mean, of course I do now, but even when I was religious, I was against the idea of, say, prayer in public school, because I knew it wouldn't be the kind of prayer that I would have wanted for myself or then for my children, you know, so I can sympathize with
Yes, and we do see issues like that happening throughout 2012, especially. There were a couple of laws that were attempted to be introduced. For example, in Indiana, there was an attempt to introduce a piece of law that would it was very, very interestingly worded because it said public schools must start the day with a recitation of the Lord's Prayer, which is a very specific, even within the Christian denominations, there's a very specific usage of a very particular translation or a very particular usage of the Lord's Prayer. But what was very interesting was that it was mandated unless, or it was required unless there was an objection. So you have to do it unless you don't want to.
Unless anybody
has a problem with it. And we thought that was really interesting. It was proposed. That kind of law generally tends to be proposed as a bit of a dog whistle for the people who propose them. They are able to then stand up and say, look what we did, we proposed this and it was shot down. Yeah. They know full well that it's unconstitutional. They know that you can't do something like that. You can't require the recitation of any particular prayer. It's okay to have a moment of silence. And definitely there are always complaints about how God is being taken out of schools. The fact is, or prayer is being taken out of schools. When the fact is, kids are free to pray in schools as long as they're not disruptive to the educational environment, which is the primary purpose of the school. And it cannot be led by the faculty of the school, especially in public schools. They are representatives they are government employees.
Right. Yeah.
And so, as such, they cannot be seen to be either promoting one particular religion or putting any other religion down. And by saying, especially, we are going to recite this particular version of one particular prayer for one particular religion, it's definitely a mixture of church and state that we consider unacceptable.
So, one more question about American United before we move into the 2012 election. When there's a chapter for a state, does that chapter pretty much concern itself with state-level elections and ballot measures?
In general, yes.
Okay.
It's going to be a group that's going to be looking at the local legislature, at the local councils. Okay. Are there council meetings that are starting the official council meetings with a prayer, and not allowing people of all faiths to participate in that. In general, if you do allow all religions to be expressed, or none at all, those are both equally acceptable. To be able to say that today, if the prayer can be started by somebody who's a Muslim, and tomorrow it can be started by somebody who's a Baptist, and the day after that could be started by a humanist or an atheist or anything in between, those are generally okay because you're not restricting or you're not promoting any particular religion. You are allowing all religious expression to occur, which is really what we want. But yes, it does. When we talk about the state locations, that's the kind of things we're looking for, is what is happening locally within the state that, A, we can raise as a concern. We can definitely have quite a bit more influence on our local legislature by having people who live in the state raising those objections. But also look at any other local issue that might need to arise that is non-legislative in nature. Issues of the use of public schools, public parks, state parks, all of these things. The misuse of those to promote or to put down any one particular religion is of concern. Okay.
Well, thanks for explaining Americans United, because that'll help as we move forward here. So we made an outline of major topics we want to cover, but they all fit under the umbrella of what made 2012 different.
Yes.
So maybe you can address that first.
Well, 2012 was very, very different because of the composition of the electorate. According to several studies, including the Public Religion Research Institute, about 20% of people now declare themselves non-religious. And of the overall electorate. And according to the exit polls that occurred in 2012 in November, about 12% of people who are asked to identify themselves on a religious scale said none. They had no religious affiliation. Now, that includes people who are atheists and people who are agnostics. It's definitely not exclusive to that group. There are a lot of people who consider themselves religious but not affiliated with any particular organization.
Or they just don't want to talk to the pollster.
Or they just don't want to talk to the pollster. Well, so that was the exit polls. That was about the 12% of that. And since it's an exit poll, it's more in person, and people tend to not declare themselves as non-religious when it's a person-to-person conversation. Over the phone, where it's a little bit more anonymous, they feel more comfortable in doing so. There's no real way to tell whether the difference between that 12% of the exit polls and the 20% of the overall electorate, how much of that was 8% of non-religious people aren't voting, or 8% of non-religious people don't want to call themselves that when they've got a microphone in their face. But it's a very interesting number. It's a lot higher than it's ever been. And we think that that is going to have some significant impact on the issues that are being addressed by the legislature. And especially when we see, for example, President Obama, the largest group. President Obama had a very ethnically diverse group of people voting for him. He had practically all of the Black and Latino voters voting Democratic, but they are also very religiously diverse and far less monolithic than people who voted for the Republican Party in this particular case. So the largest religious category or religious quote-unquote group or self-identified group for Obama supporters were the non-affiliated, about 23%. So larger than, for example, the largest religious category of Romney supporters was white mainline Protestant, who was 37%. So you look at those differences and you say there's a larger, more monolithic electorate going for one particular party than for the other. And we think in general, that's a relatively good thing. It means that there's an acceptance of diversity and a recognition of the fact that, that we have to reach across these different groups in order to be able to govern effectively. And so, again, non-affiliated, 23% to Romney's 8% of the non-affiliated, 37% of white mainline Protestant to Obama's 9% of that particular group who voted for the Republican candidate. And there's also very significant differences in things like the frequency of church attendance. When that breaks down, you see that you have about 62 people who say they never go to church voted for Barack Obama. 63% of people who say they go to church more than once a week voted Republican. So the composition of the electorate is changing quite significantly as the racial composition changes very quickly as well. We see, for example, in Texas, we see the racial composition changing so significantly that it's entirely possible with the growth of the Hispanic population and the white mainline Protestant group generally being older. We see a significant change to the point where it's possible in the year 2020 it may no longer be the red state we think of it today. It may be actually a more blue state. And that just has to do with the different composition, the changing demographics within the country.
Yeah. That's an amazing thought, because Texas is one of those states that you figure you can count on as being a red state, like California being blue or Minnesota being blue.
Or Minnesota being relatively blue.
Yeah.
And it has to do with the difference between the big cities and the outlying areas as well. There's a lot of different things that are changing. But we think that what is going to tip the scales a little bit, and we really think that between 2008, we saw some of this happening, but 2012 became a lot clearer, is the fact that there's this recognition that this is a large voting bloc, that instead of being ignored in order to pander to particular, especially fundamentalist religious groups, that there has to be this recognition that we're very diverse, and that we form an interest group that both people who are atheists, agnostics, or non-religious, that we form an interest group that needs to be appealed to. Now, we don't necessarily believe that that means that we'll see the atheist party in the next elections, right? It's not changing that frequently, but we do think that that as a voting bloc, the people who are defining themselves as non-religious are going to be courted quite a bit more, not as candidates potentially, but definitely as voters, and that leads to several differences in the way some of these elections are carried out. We saw in 2010, especially, which was a very religiously contentious election in the sense of a lot of people trying to put religious issues on the ballot. But there were some accusations flying around from different candidates who saying you shouldn't vote for this person because they're an atheist. That was actually expressed to say this candidate is an atheist, that's a negative point for them. That didn't really happen in 2012, and it backfired in 2010 a little bit. And I think in 2012 we're seeing a little bit more of that backfiring, of that use of atheism as a divider. That is not going to work for the majority of the population anymore, because it's not going. We think that those type of attacks are going to be diminishing because they're not going to be considered acceptable anymore.
Yeah.
You can't say that when you're talking about a fifth of the potentially up to a fifth of the population.
Yeah. Or even 10%. I mean, even a few percent 10%. If they recognize it, because
Absolutely.
it can tip the scales when things have been so tight in so many different elections.
Well, it's an appeal to diversity, and it's appeal to being inclusive and to reaching out to interests of a group that in general it's been relatively safe to ignore, and it's no longer safe to do so. We've seen the statistics as to how atheists are the least trusted groups.
Yeah.
We think that's changing. We really do, because once you reach that tipping point of who the electorate is, you can no longer say that. You can no longer make that safe statement and have everybody agree with you that, oh yes, we all think this about this particular section of the population when it becomes such a significant minority. Still a minority, but still.
Yeah, still. So that bodes well for secular people, for atheists. So we were saying that another major change that we saw, a development from the 2012 election, is that generally the voters rejected people who took a hardline stance against issues such as abortion. So
yes, and there's a significant point to be made there to say it's not that the general population rejects abortion or is favorable of abortion. I mean, that's still a very contentious issue. Mm-hmm. What we did see is the rejection of people who are very hardline for reasons that are purely religious. And we see that as a positive thing, and not necessarily because we want to see all religion taken out of the public square, which is one of the things that is an accusation constantly lobbed against groups like Americans United and the ACLU and even the atheist groups. We don't. What we want is to see a law set, or a set of laws within our communities that are based in principle on secular reasons. We really can't have laws put in place that are based purely or even primarily on religious reasons. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to do that in a very diverse community and not manage to alienate, for religious reasons, a significant portion of that group.
And you think voters are starting to wake up to that more, or becoming more sensitive to
We
that?
like to hope so, and we'll definitely see what happens in 2014 and 2016 in the next elections to see whether this is a trend or whether this is really an outlier. But what we did see was a couple of candidates who made very clear expressions of their positions, and that those positions were very religious in nature, and that they're taking that position really did not have that kind of secular reasoning behind it. It was purely religious and very exclusionary. Mm-hmm. And so we had, for example, a couple of candidates like Republican Todd Akin from Missouri, who had the whole, the female body will legitimately shut down a pregnancy if it comes from rape, which was an incredible statement to make, really, and that was the comment that some would say lost him the election. He got legitimately shut down by the electorate. He lost to Claire McCaskill, and previous to that particular comment, they had been running a very, very close race with Akin definitely in the lead.
And Akin was the incumbent too.
Yes, he was. Yeah. He was the incumbent, and everybody was projecting him to win. It was a very clear statement, in our mind at least, that kind of purely religious perspective makes people, at the very least, makes them uncomfortable, mm-hmm. and they won't support it. And we had also Richard Murdoch, who was talking about a baby that was born, or a pregnancy that resulted from a rape, was a gift from God. And people found that to be very uncomfortable too. And he lost to Joe Connolly. And the candidates who were using faith to justify their positions rather than secular reasons, that was what really seemed to drive some discomfort in voters, where they're starting to see, yes, we see if this kind of expression, openly expressed by candidates who are intended to represent our entire state or our entire community.
So those two men lost because, not just because of their hardline stance, but because of how they verbalized it.
Because they expressed it out loud, some would say. I mean, we obviously still believe that there are plenty of people within Congress, within the legislature,
Right.
who probably believe things very
Yes,
similar to that.
I think so too, yeah.
They, even within the state of Minnesota. But saying it out loud is, and being rejected for saying something like that out loud is kind of the first step. It becomes inappropriate to say, in the same way that it became inappropriate to call someone an atheist as an insult as part of the election. Obviously, that's not done yet. We're not finished with that work, but it's getting there, and it's slowly becoming less comfortable for doing that. And to do that, and what the other thing we do see is in Congress, we do see more members who are. Unfortunately, we lost Pete Stark in the state of California. I mean, he was in Congress since 1973, and he lost his seat. He was the really only open atheist at the time in Congress. But we did have Kristen Sinema, who was a non-theist. She was elected by a narrow margin in the House in Arizona, and she has worked with the Secular Coalition for Arizona quite significantly in the past. We also had, and this relates to some of the other topics of the 2012 election, Tammy Baldwin, elected to the Senate in Wisconsin, first openly bisexual senator, and does not list a religious affiliation in her.
Do most list a religion?
Most of them do.
Okay,
Oh, absolutely.
So it's significant that she doesn't list something.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's in fact, it's been kind of common knowledge for a very long time within elections within the United States that unless you are, a full Christian and you acknowledge that,
right,
and you say this is who I follow, that your chances of getting elected are very low. And what we had was Kirsten being elected, Tammy Baldwin being elected, but we also had in Hawaii Mazie Hirono, and she defeated former Governor Linda Lingle. She is now the first Buddhist in the Senate. And also in Hawaii, we had Tulsi Gabbard, who defeated Kawika Crowley, and that made Gabbard the first Hindu in Congress. We also have people who are Catholic. For example, Senator Tim Kaine, who's in Virginia. He's a very strong proponent of church and state separation, so he's worked very closely with groups that support that view in the past, and so we're very happy to see him there too. So what we like to see is that diversity. What we like to see is that acceptance within these groups, within the legislatures, that we are a very diverse group. We are pluralistic. We have people who represent a large amount of very, very different beliefs. And so you cannot anymore, we hope, this is what we're struggling for, this is what we're fighting for, assume a particular religious orientation for the people that you are representing and say, if I say this, which is supportive of this particular religion, I'll be okay. You have to, you can express your personal beliefs as a member of the legislature. That's absolutely not a problem. Everybody in the legislature will have their beliefs or non-beliefs. What should become harder, and what we want to make harder, is saying, I am going to put this into law because it is my religious belief. And there's no secular reason behind it. If there is a secular reason for it, fantastic, then let's use the secular reason, but then the religious reason becomes extraneous. But that's what we want to put a stop to saying this religious definition or this religious rationale for this law is really the primary one I'm putting it forth, because you're going to be alienating more and more people as that happens, and that's problematic.
So when we look at the Senate, you say that we have one Buddhist there now. So are Buddhists 1% of the country? Maybe it's sufficient that there's only one Buddhist in the Senate.
It's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. At the same time, you have things are very unbalanced in the Senate today anyway. Just in terms of representation of Jewish groups, Catholic groups, Protestant groups, it's not representative. We don't
even
have
gender. Women are not between 49 and 51% of the Senate.
Sure, and we are improving, absolutely. This is I think this is the Congress that has the greatest amount of female senators and members of the House in history, which is a great thing. And again, it appeals to that diversity, to that pluralism, to say we need to appeal to everybody. We're a democracy, everybody needs to be represented, and we have not been well represented in the past. And that has led to segregation. It has led to violation of this church and separation, because people assume, hey, everybody around me kind of thinks the same way I do, therefore it's okay for me to propose this law. The more diversity you see and groups of people who are sitting around and having these conversations. What should we propose? What do we think is going to be good for the country? The more diversity you have there, the better those laws will be overall, because you're taking into account this diversity and this pluralism of viewpoints.
Well, and especially if you have a fellow legislator sitting next to you with a differing viewpoint. I mean, you have to take that into consideration a lot more immediately than if there's just some anonymous group back home.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
And being non-anonymous is critical to this. We really believe that over the past few years, the openness of people declaring themselves to be atheists and groups like Americans United, groups like the ACLU, which has been working tirelessly for decades on this type of issue, groups like the atheist groups, including Atheists of Minnesota, all of this raises visibility. And having that voice be heard is really a first step, because a lot of people are going to be turning around and saying, oh, I was not aware of the privilege I was bringing to the table, because I assume, since nobody was saying anything different than what I think, that everybody thought the same way I did. And
is there maybe some legitimacy to that too? I mean, 150 years ago, there maybe were no, to use Buddhists again, maybe no Buddhists to represent.
Well, I think there were.
Okay.
I think it was at the time, in the same way when we talk about the history, for example, of atheism, and we see people talk about the scientists who came out of the church, or who were funded by the church or helped by the church. And people say, well, what about these people? They were religious, and yet they followed science. But the fact is, there was a long period in our history where you could not be a public atheist.
That makes sense,
you could not be publicly gay. You could not be expressing opinions that went against the majority. And in many cases, it was even illegal to do so. Middle Ages, you could be burned at the stake if you did it to the wrong people. So it has been problematic over time to express the fact that you're different.
All right, that makes sense. Thank you for clearing that up. I just was wondering because, if people are trying to represent, if there's nobody in their electorate to represent, from that viewpoint.
Yes.
But that makes sense. So we have a lot more that we're going to talk about, including the specific ballot measures, amendments to various state constitutions, but we'll have to do that in the other half of the show because we're out of time now. But thank you, David, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Looking forward to the conversation. Yes, me too. We'll start it up in just a second here. And thank you for listening to the show. If you're interested in us, we're interested in you. If you contact us, we will send you a copy of our newsletter so you can learn more about this show, our radio program, other events that we have going on throughout the Twin Cities all the time. So please contact us on what you see on the screen because, like I said, if you're interested in us, we're interested in you. Thank you.